If people want to use this and are using it and have value in it, we're going to scale this thing fast, and it will be in a way that users can appreciate, and it will work. But you need to have the economic value. As crazy as this world is, I think we're very, very much at the still absolute beginning in crypto, in my opinion.
Did you change your lifestyle by investing in Facebook and Google and Amazon and these other companies? And most people say no. And the whole blockchain space is almost like an opportunity to be a part of this future and build it.
Yeah. Oh, it's unprecedented. And it's, again, it's, in my opinion, very, very inevitable. Oh, your money isn't safe, right? Don't keep your money under the mattress. You got to put it in the bank, because the bank will put it in the vault and they'll secure your money. Oh, now we need regulatory agencies to make sure that the guardian of your funds isn't stealing it. So now there's like a whole nother level on top of it. And now in these protocols, it's all open and transparent to where they can't even take it if they wanted to.
And 2% of the world now is in this echo chamber of crypto, and we think everyone knows about it. It's just you and your 5 friends know. I think it might actually make us become the best versions of ourselves.
That's another thing about like crypto that is really compelling. It's math, it's science, it's economics, it's philosophy, it's communities, everything. It's literally like every little element of like a business or a technology is all woven into like the fabric of how these works. There's never a dull moment. That is absolutely for sure.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Tyler Spalding, the technologist, software engineer, entrepreneur, and blockchain investor. You've spent the last 20 years innovating, investing in, and developing new technologies, along the way authoring over 50 patents and working on the NASA Space Shuttle program. You were an early Bitcoin adopter in 2011 and were heavily involved in the first wave of cryptocurrency investment. In 2018, you co-founded the payment network Flexa, which makes it easier for retailers and businesses to accept crypto payments using the AMP token, which now has over a $2 billion in market cap. Tyler, welcome to London Real.
Thanks for having me. This is going to be really exciting. Nice to formally meet you, Brian, and looking forward to the conversation.
Look, I'm super excited. We also share a really weird background. I studied mechanical engineering. I actually worked at the Aerospace Corporation for 2 summers in Los Angeles. Before, I actually took a bunch of finance classes at the Sloan School of Management. For people that don't know, Tyler was also mechanical engineer to aerospace, and you also, I think, spent 2 years at the Sloan School of Management as well. You know, when you look back on those engineering days, what do you remember? Do you miss anything about it? You know, I know you were working for NASA and all that stuff. What do you remember?
Wow. So that question can get at the heartstrings. So the short answer is I miss it deeply, but I have managed to cope. So I guess I'm just an engineer, completely an engineer by trade. So it's much more in hardware, aerospace, mechanical, as you mentioned. And so I think working at NASA and being able to, you know, put vehicles up into space and meet all of the astronauts and feel this like intense pride with your work is something you really just can't accomplish anywhere else. So I passionately miss that, absolutely love it, but I don't have any regrets. And the main issue is that when you're working on these large scale projects, I worked on, the Mars Crew Module, which might go land on Mars and take people to Mars in a few more years, maybe. And that was actually in 2007, 2008, I was working on that. So the time scales are just so much longer. And then when you start getting into software And now, even in a completely exponential world of crypto, you can, make changes, life-altering changes in a matter of minutes, days, weeks. And so that's really what kind of drove me more into software. But as like kind of a deeper engineer, I do miss some of that analysis and working through that for sure. But it's definitely evolved into something that I'm really equally as proud of, and also just kind of solving some really large scale problems, which is exciting.
Yeah, you're giving me flashbacks because, when I was at MIT, we had a 4-year degree in mechanical engineering. And one of the big classes it's called 270, where they give you a box of stuff and you have to build these robots that fight each other. It became quite famous. And I worked at Ford Motor Company for a summer. I used to have a 68 Mustang. And when I was at Ford, I was at the plants. I went to the casting plant. I was working on like an emissions device for a Crown Vic that was going to be made 6 years from now. And when I was at Aerospace Corp, we were working on the Galileo space probe. I think the high gain antenna wasn't working and it was out in space and we were trying to figure out how to get it working. And like you said, it's cool doing real tangible things, but the time scale is so extended compared to software, let alone crypto, blockchain, where things can happen at a hyper accelerated rate. So it is different worlds, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. But yeah, it's kind of like I said, I treasure and deeply value every minute I spent on the space shuttle program and really wouldn't trade it for anything else. And all the other agencies I got to work through, because it's really this larger web. So it's, Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and Boeing and all the other contractors, the Air Force. I did some other really interesting composite work with them. So it's like getting to see some of this more deeply and be a part of that like bigger mission. I mean, it's tough, right? There's a lot of companies and other corporations that have done well and have great brands, they have great products, and you feel that sense of pride. But man, when you walk into like the secret the security areas, you're badging in and you're sitting here with like 20 years worth of astronaut photos and the actual hardware, and you're driving up and there's rockets outside, that sense of pride and like, all right, we have to do this, is just like nothing else I've ever felt. And so that was a really, really cool experience.
Yeah, it's almost epic, the kind of things you're doing. I mean, it's, what's the biggest thing that humanity has ever done? Put a man on the moon, right? That's, most people would have to agree.
Oh, and we only have an hour or so here, but if we had about a day or so, I strongly agree with that statement to such an intensity. And just for a little bit, maybe for other users or viewers, if you research what the effects of the moon landings, the Apollo program actually influenced, it literally created all of Silicon Valley. So everything we know about where it is, how it got built, all the capital, all the other companies, modern venture firms, most of the most valuable companies in the world, why they all came from, literally stemmed from the space program funding Fairchild Semiconductor. The founders then moved on. It was even validating these MIT engineers coming from Boston that, all you did was go to work for GE. You didn't start your own company. I mean, you're just completely crazy. They went out and did that. No one else could buy their product because it was the new transistor and no one had enough money and no one had the use. But the space program had lots of money to fund the exact thing that they needed in order to make it a success. And so it's a long, long rabbit hole, very deep. But I strongly believe that, and that it's actually probably the most significant thing we've ever done as part of just humanity.
Wow. All right. I'm going to think about that later. I have never actually heard that thesis that the space program then created, that early, like you said, transistor kind of VC vibe that then exploded into the valley. It's definitely a phenomenon, very geographic and time specific, but I hadn't thought about the space program pushing that. Just think, JFK making that speech that one day, right? Just brought everything in motion.
Then you want to, and then, yeah, not to go too deep, but then what's even more crazy is that as supportive as JFK was of the entire program, he was actually going to cancel it because it was behind schedule. It was costing more money. It was losing favoritism. So he was, and this is all documented like in Smithsonian, and there's like lots of literature around this. So he was literally going to cancel it. And then when he got assassinated, it was then viewed as like, oh, we now can't cancel this. This is going to become like a motivating, a rallying, like, even though it costs a lot more money, the cost actually lessened in the public sphere. So it actually, LBJ then picked this up and then now finish the program when it was actually going to be canceled. So the weird serendipity around how all this comes together is completely insane.
That is so intense. I mean, I spent 6 months this year running to be mayor of London, and I didn't win, if you didn't notice. And I got to see a little bit of politics. I have never been a politician, but I can see how, it's all about selling it to the public, isn't it? To keep that funding going. And that's interesting. I'm going to look into that as well. Before we go on to, talk about finance today, when you see Elon Musk doing SpaceX versus what NASA was doing, what do you see pros and cons? I would say, personally, they're good at marketing it. Like, they really do the finishing touches. They do the comms really well. Not that it was ever bad in the past, but they seem to do it super slick. And they sell that dream, which is all part of the funding too. What do you see when you see that from as an insider?
Oh, it's absolutely vital. So the key thing is that what SpaceX is really doing is commercializing space flight, cargo into space, because that's what the space shuttle was supposed to be. It was literally called the Space Transportation System, STS, and it ended up costing a lot more money than people really recognized. And so to get hardware into space or low Earth orbit is incredibly expensive. And the reality is, it's going to be a business, right? NASA and the governments are not going to be good at owning, a private business. So what they do, it allows NASA to focus on lots and lots of dollars on the crazy stuff, getting people to Mars, right? Doing all these other experiments, building the space station, running all these very specific experiments that cost lots of money and can also have international exposure. Whereas then these private companies can now focus on getting things, hardware stuff into space. And that's going to be really revolutionary for us. One really easy piece is once we can start getting satellite internet, we have this, it works. And so as the price goes down a little, within the next 10 years, it is completely not unreasonable to think we'll have, broadband internet everywhere in the world on any location on the entire Earth, to where, our kids, when you say, oh, back in the day when we didn't have Wi-Fi, right, in the Sahara Desert, they're like, what are you, crazy? What do you mean? We have Wi-Fi everywhere. It works all the time. This internet is ubiquitous, right? And, that's a reality that's coming very soon. And it will get created exactly through putting all this hardware into space, maintaining it, and doing it in a cost-effective way. And that's not something the government's really well suited for. So SpaceX is playing a very vital, absolutely vital role in commercializing that component of kind of space flight.
Yeah, when you listen to Elon talk about his, dropping the cost per pound of getting something into low Earth orbit, and how he plans to kind of make it 1/10 of what it is, in 5 years' time, you can start to see what you're talking about and what he's talking about. I think it's hard for the public to understand what that will mean, just like the public, it's hard for them to understand what the internet was going to mean or what blockchain was going to mean. But if you're a technologist, you can kind of be like, oh, wow, this is going to open up so much stuff.
Yeah, the space program was $45,000 per pound to get up into orbit. And now, as it relates to crypto, now you can see how, we have internet everywhere. Think about what that's going to mean now for people to be able to participate in proof of stake networks, using their phones, having now universal access now. It's actually, as all worlds converge into software, this becomes even way more exciting even for crypto, as now truly democratizes anyone in the world being able to participate in these networks like never before.
Right.
So that's another kind of side, huge tangential benefit of space.
Right. So that space-enabled, potentially grow up broadband everywhere could tap into those 2 to 4 billion people of unbanked people out there, maybe give them mobile access and pull them in to this exciting world of crypto, blockchain, and all the new monetary services.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about repressed states, right? Right now, if you're in certain states, you can't get uncensored internet. You will very soon, and there won't be anything states can do about it, because now you can access it globally. It'll be satellite internet. It's all, it's so inevitable. It's only, within 10 years, it's an inevitability for sure.
That's exciting. Tyler, it just crossed my mind that you look a little bit like a potential astronaut, like one of the guys from The Right Stuff, a little bit,
I'm too tall. I would not do well in confined environments for too long of a time.
It's funny, I had Chris Hadfield in here, who was up in space for, I think, over a year. He was that Canadian astronaut that took all the pictures and did the Major Tom video up there. And I think he just came out with a book a couple books ago, and it was talking about how all the isolation we felt in the pandemic. He said that's what space is like. It's totally uncertain. You can't talk to anybody. You don't know what's going to happen. And it was a really good reflection of kind of where we're at now from someone who'd kind of been in space. I want to ask you quickly about MIT Sloan School of Management, and then I want to jump into Flexa and AMP. You spent some time there. I learned I took about a year of courses there when I graduated back in the day, early 90s, and I learned futures and options and all sorts of great stuff. I really learned about it when I was on Wall Street trading it, but it was a great environment. I'm actually watching a course Gary Gensler talk on blockchain at Sloan in 2018. It's very interesting to watch Gary. I'm about 12 hours in. First of all, he's extremely intelligent and explains blockchain really well, and also reminds people that cryptography has been around for a while. Zero knowledge proofs have been a while, way before the crypto, not to mention all of the elements of the internet was involved way before the dot-com boom. So he has a good kind of a history like you do, with space program and technology. What's the one thing you got from Sloan?
There were many. I'd say the most important for sure was literally just the people. So it was the focus, and for me, I'd already started a couple companies. I had some exits, and so for me, it was really the time to break away and just meet really smart people over a long period without all the stress and the burden of running a company, having a job, right, having other accountabilities. That was really what was so valuable to me, and honestly. Some of those friendships I've maintained are going to be absolutely lifelong friendships, even this week. One of my friends hadn't known before was someone in my graduating class is the founder of Cello, another blockchain project that's also consumer focused around spending crypto now all over the world. So it's this just completely like kind of total serendipity of how we're doing somewhat similar things and still get to work on these things. Is one of my good friends, and getting to see him this week even too. So it's like, that's the sort of thing I feel like you get from one of those top schools. And then particularly MIT, just because it's a little more unique. It's kind of self-caters. People come in self-selecting into that kind of cultural mindset of being a little weird, I think, in a really good, positive way. It draws out really that meritocracy, a little bit more of this engineering quirkiness, which I absolutely love and I think is the greatest thing.
Yeah, MIT, we definitely embraced the weirdness there, for sure. It was funny because I met someone later who was down the road at Harvard, and they were like, "Oh, well, at Harvard, how you had to belong to the dinner club and the this and the that," and at MIT, it was just like, "Are you smart or not? Can you deliver or not? Can you embrace it or not? We don't care about anything else." It again embraces the weirdness, and it was fun. I was one of those pesky undergrads in the Sloan schools who was doing vector calculus and was probably blowing you guys away on the math, and you were one of the people that was come either from Wall Street or coming from a little bit of time off and probably struggling. Well, you probably weren't, but some of the people were struggling with the math. I remember those times. Do you miss Boston at all?
Yeah, I like it because it's the most European U.S. city, and so it's really small. It's got a little bit of history. The U.S., it's something we don't really have is longer term history. So when you go visit some of these other, as you travel, particularly around Europe, and like, wow, these are 500-year-old buildings, 600-year-old buildings, 1,000, and no, we got like 200 at best, right? So, and that's not all bad, but so it's cool to have some of that history that is really still prevalent, I think, in Boston as like this kind of the heart, I think, of like historic United States that I really like.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, I probably value it more now that I've been in London. You go back in Boston, you see statues and all the stuff that happened there over hundreds of years. So
it was actually, I got married around earlier in the Boston Library. So that was a whole part of, I actually met my wife in Boston. We went to school together. And so that was like a big thing for us. So it was really cool being in that heart of the city in that building.
That's epic. I got fond memories of that place. Again, I was 18 years old and I went there and lived in a fraternity house in Cambridge for 4 years.
Okay.
One of my fraternity brothers just became the California state senator, Alex Padilla, as well. Really weird stuff. At the time, we just were like,
that's it, yeah.
But then like over time, people go do crazy stuff and you're like, what? And he's probably thinking, and Brian Rose became the guy from London Real. So yeah, it's weird how people do interesting things. All right, let's jump into Flexa and everything you've been doing since 2018 and the AMP token, you said that you are, quote, unlocking the value where you have it. And I want to just give it a little reference before you can explain what you're doing. I created something we call the DeFi Academy, and I got hundreds of students that are going through the education process of learning about DeFi. And two of the things they complain about, quite frankly, Tyler, is getting fiat into crypto and then using their crypto, and they're both very difficult things. And I think you're potentially solving that secondary one, is that right now they're almost two different worlds. Like there's an on-ramp and an off-ramp. And when you're on the highway of crypto, you're involved, you're invested, you can maybe go to the DEXs, but when you're off, you're not. And right now, when it comes to payment, there's so many people that are talking about crypto, that invest in crypto, but I would say very few of those people use crypto to go buy things at Starbucks, at restaurants, etc. And I think that's where you guys come in. So maybe you can tell me and tell everybody here, what is the thesis behind Flexa? What have you guys been doing?
Sure. So yeah, like kind of your first point there around just crypto usage and the prevalence that we're now seeing, which is fantastic. That's great for these peer-to-peer networks as decentralized money or value and those sorts of things, which is excellent. But now to bring it more into like this real world or using it for like merchants, right? There's so many different types of chains, assets, the complexity around what these things are, even classifying them, right? They're kind of securities, they're kind of currencies, but they're not. They're sort of this like new instrument that's been created, and then it's all digital format. So a merchant though really would love to get paid with anything as long as it can be cheaper or faster or have less fraud, as there's some benefit to them. But there's just no way, being a large merchant, you can integrate any of this sort of stuff at any realistic scale. So Flexa now has looked at this and said, oh, we can use some of the power of these new decentralized networks and actually drive the cost of like validating payments and the risk associated with payments down to almost zero. And we could build a network that uses some of this new technology. And then what we do is really just integrate with the merchants across their entire stack. So the software, the hardware, everything they already have, just to make accepting all these new types of assets just extremely simple. So no new upgrades, no new hardware, no even new flows, right? Everything being exactly the same. And so Flexa is really about integrating very deeply with everything a merchant will have in store, online, and now allowing universal acceptance of assets from really any wallet too, which is the other really important piece. So it's, as this has evolved from day one, any asset. So it could be cryptocurrency assets, loyalty point assets, your bank balance, anything where you already have your app and you have value on it. You could now essentially pay through Flexa. And like, that's really what the vision has been. And then now incorporating that into a new structure that allows this to be, less than a tenth of the price or less than a tenth of the cost to a merchant. And then without all of the fraud, becomes really compelling to them to embrace something like this.
Yeah, that's what you really caught my eye when I first started watching some videos on you, because look, it's one thing if you are able to allow me to take my crypto and make payments with it. Like that would already be something we don't see right now. And I'd love to walk through the current state of the union when it comes to crypto payments. But if I could take my phone and use what you're doing to tap into my bank and do a bank transfer, which I can't do right now to buy a cup of coffee at Starbucks, if I could tap into my loyalty points, if I could tap into a number of assets, I don't know, my tokenized real estate or my cattle or whatever, I don't know. Maybe the sky's the limit. And again, as there becomes exchanges for some of these tokens, whether it's loyalty points or something, that gets really kind of mind-bending, where potentially I've got all these assets on my phone or in my own little metaverse that I can exchange with someone else, as long as there's a payment system that I guess can recognize them, collateralize them, and then make sure they're secure. Is that the kind of vision you have?
That's exactly the vision. And so it's really focused on commerce though. So I will say we won't really, we can help facilitate some peer-to-peer and others, but for us, it's really about how do we just make this work for commerce? And then the real key is, how does it become just so dead simple, either exactly as it is now or much easier? So on the merchant side, they get paid exactly like they would. They get fiat currencies in their bank account that looks all exactly the same for reconciliation, how they get money, how they treat money, what it all looks like in their back of house, identical. And then to the consumer, how do you make it that all of these other assets, you just tap a button and scan something? It's literally that simple. If you add anything else into this flow, it'll just never work. And so people really like to approach some of this of, oh, my new technology or my new token or my new consensus or this, right? It's never going to reach real mainstream adoption because you have to make it so simple to where the reality is. So sometimes people will say to me, well, how are you going to onboard and explain all of this to new users or these new wallets, or how do you grow? It's like, well, we're actually not going to do it. This is going to power the things they're doing, and they won't even know. And frankly, they won't care. Just like when you take your phone, it has Apple Pay, and you hold it up to the RFID, stuff happens behind the scenes. And as a user, you could really care less. Honestly, as a merchant, you could care less. You just want to get paid. It's all about making that transaction happen. And currently, the majority of those transactions are routed through many complexities that cost a lot of money and expose lots of vulnerability that are 50 years old and have just they've been great monopolies, and so they haven't been able to, they don't need to innovate. These are extremely profitable companies doing this, and so there's a lot left there. And so now this is kind of exactly how innovation works when there's a new technology that can completely change the game, and that's really what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I guess as an entrepreneur, you really got to focus on solving one specific problem. Everybody wants you to solve 10 problems, but there's no way any company actually successfully does that. Amazon isn't good at having stores, and Walmart's not good at delivering packages. So, right, stick to what you're good at.
Right.
And I think I heard you quote somewhere that like 86% of the commercial transactions are taking place in person anyways, and that's the market you're going for. Did I get that stat right? Or was that pre-pandemic? Or
no, that's post-pandemic.
Really?
No, it's actually
that would
be over 90% in the US. Yeah.
That's what would surprise most people because they just assume they're making everything online in payments. But is the reality different because they're not remembering each one of those physical payments they make?
Yeah. So think about anyone that drives. All your fuel purchases are done in person. When you go to the grocery store, all of those purchases are done in person. Still, clothing and other like durable goods at home, all your furniture is a lot of it is purchased in person. So there's surprisingly a lot more, physical retail payments than I think people recognize, particularly around grocery. Those are some of the biggest markets out there. So, or like, a movie theater, right? All these things you start adding up, you're like, oh, I actually do a lot of these things as like a physical human being. And I'm making all these payments where a lot of the convenience products you're often buying online. So e-commerce is absolutely still accelerating, right? So it's not slowing down at all, and the pandemic made it growing faster. So I think that number is going to continue going down and down and down, but I don't see a world where it becomes zero, or there'll be some point where it stabilizes, where there's just a certain amount of things we always buy in person. It'll just maintain that way.
Yeah, now that I think about it, every time I double click my phone and use Apple Pay during the day, it's quite a few times, because I'm walking here doing this, doing that. So it's actually more than how often do I use Amazon? Once every couple days. So it makes a really good point. All right, let's look at a use case scenario right now. Say I go to a store that accepts, say, Bitcoin, if you find one out there, or Litecoin, and it gives me the option of paying with crypto versus that same store that accepts Flexa. And I don't know a good example. I don't know if Starbucks accepts that. Probably it doesn't. But I walk in right now. First of all, is it even physically possible to pay with Bitcoin with the speed of transactions right now? What is the current state of the art? Because I don't think most people know transaction times, any of those other friction points that are currently there.
Oh man, that's I could take a few hours to answer that question. The short answer is it depends, and it's all about the context. So first thing is, do people want to spend Bitcoins? That's already a whole hurdle and discussion right just there. But assuming they do,
but they don't. They don't, do they?
I don't think they do. I mean, why would you, right? It's narrative right now, right, wrong, or whatever, is that it's a store of value. And why would you go buy things with the store of value that you've bought with the intent of it appreciating further, as a narrative, right? So you can agree or disagree, but that is the prominent narrative. So I don't really think people want to spend that stuff. But assuming they do, now it really depends on what you're buying and what the context is. If it's someone that you reasonably trust, or it's a small transaction, you could probably do zero, unconfirmed transactions, just anything in the mempool is going to be fine. And you can actually get transactions pretty quickly that way. So buying coffee in a reasonable way from someone, or a small or medium-sized merchant, might just work great, actually.
With like Bitcoin, with Bitcoin would probably, but only Bitcoin right now. Nothing else would.
Almost anything, right? If it was a small transaction, if you were to give me $10 in crypto with really, because the only thing that can happen is that you would basically replace that transaction with a higher fee transaction, or you could work through some sort of a malicious network to try to take over the network, or you had some insider information, you knew there was going to be some sort of weird fork happening, like these sorts of things. The reality is for a $10 transaction, that just doesn't even play into the scope of practical usability. So for small transactions, I think it's just completely fine. You can just say, oh, hit the mempool. It only takes a few seconds. Like this would actually be fine, and I can accept this payment. The problem, though, is that it starts to scale. That becomes now non-trivial of what risk is actually there. So there isn't an exact, threshold. But let's say you're someone like Walmart, and you might be accepting $10 million worth of transactions within 10 minutes. That's now a problem, because that is a scale where now a miner could collude and actually, present a different version of the chain, and now all those transactions never occurred, right? Or you could replace all those transactions, with replace by fee, and that's so economically feasible. Like, in fact, it's like the outcome. This is what fraudsters do. There's literally stats that say something like, a sad stat of something like all internet traffic to the continent of Africa, like 60% is fraud, like 60, because of how many operations have been set up there around just like literally financial transaction fraud. So that's just the scale that we're dealing with, to where if you're going to open up a network like this, like they don't understand it now and it's not accepted the same way, but there is zero chance that if there's a vulnerability where people can print tens of millions of dollars just through a simple vulnerability like that, it will happen. So there's a threshold where it becomes practically usable and fine, versus there's no possible way we would ever consider this because this would be financial suicide. Okay. So there's some inflection in the middle.
Now, even though these are in-persons, because it's one thing if I swarm their online site with, 400 orders and 1,000 each, but if you got to be in person for each one, does that reduce the chance of fraud, or it still can be done?
Still depends, right? So let's say it was large enough and I was buying a $5,000 TV or something, right, from one of these places. And then I had 100 of my friends, or 1,000, because again, these are crime syndicates that literally do this today. And 1,000 people are now all of a sudden buying these multi-$1,000 TVs to really push this up into the multi-million-dollar figures all at once. And at a scale like Walmart, you have more than 1,000 stores. So that's actually fairly feasible and wouldn't even look all that crazy to happen. And what they do is you make all those transactions, and now all of a sudden there's millions of dollars worth of one confirmation transactions. And then you could just, attack the chain and potentially, publish a new version, and you could collude with miners. And again, is it likely? Probably not, but it's a possibility. And it's certainly not a risk that a merchant would underwrite by saying, oh yeah, we'll do this. And we're totally subject to this black swan of something happening. And we could just lose all these transactions, all this value at any given time. Because the short is just talking around economic finality, to where the easy description is, let's just hypothetically say it costs $50,000 to, it's close, write a block to the Bitcoin blockchain, right? So if that costs you $50,000, if I'm going to give you $500,000 in a transaction, well, economically, just very hand wavy and straightforward, I should wait for 10 Bitcoin blocks, because in theory, then it's economically advantageous to you to try to build the system to actually, take over the chain, rewrite transactions, because I need 10 blocks, which would equate to $500,000 worth of value, where you'd get more than that back if you were able to rewrite the chain in less than 10 blocks. So that's, a little bit of hand wavy math, but the concept is absolutely true. And so that's what this economic finality concept is, everyone likes to talk about, oh, this state of this blockchain is final, right? This is a final state, like, totally immutable. Like, yes, but there's always a cost where it can be. There's always a non-infinite cost to make something completely rewritable and to change the state of the chain. If you take over the chain, or in a proof of stake network, there's other types of different attacks that you can experience. So again, you just need to get to a state where that's economically infeasible or economically not valuable, and then you're in great shape.
Right.
So I am by no means saying this is a a negative necessarily of the system, but it's a limitation that to really harness all these sorts of payments, you just need to be really aware of. It's things like how exchanges, right? Crypto exchanges are the same, where they wait for a certain amount of confirmations before they'll let you trade or withdraw assets, right? So it's all just very much the same concept.
What kind of coins are going through your brain when you're thinking about this? Like, I guess you're clearly thinking about Bitcoin, maybe Ethereum, maybe Dogecoin because people use it. Are there other coins that you're already thinking? I mean, you said proof of stake. I don't think any of those yet have proof of stake. So you're thinking about a few other. What are some of them, without calling out everybody, the coins that you just think for, big market shares, I better be thinking about those use cases?
Oh man, we really need to see. I honestly don't think any of the proof of stake networks currently, despite their market caps, have much fundamental usage beyond just like sort of speculation, and they're really much in the building stages right now, which isn't bad, but they're sort of growing, and we'll have to see what people start to use for. A lot of people are trying to say, oh, we're just gonna have this Ethereum clone or this Ethereum killer, and we're just gonna make something faster. It's like, well, that's done. It's done really well. It has like an extremely secure base layer security. So it remains to be seen. I think there's definitely some interesting technologies that are out there that might end up being, I think they'll end up being collaborative with Ethereum personally. That's my personal take, is that they'll start enabling other types of computations or other types of value that then you could potentially write proofs to the Ethereum chain or things like that. That I think they can all coexist. I think a world of thinking there's going to be one universal blockchain and nothing else, not hundreds of others, I don't think is really possible. I mean, we can't as humans agree on anything. We have, we don't even know how many countries there are, right? I mean, that's literally a statement. Like, how many countries are there in the world? Well, it depends who you're talking to. There's between 180 to 210, right? So to think that we're all just going to have one universal base layer, I think, isn't really going to happen. So there'll be room for a lot of these things to coexist and work together. So we'll really just see. But currently, I don't see any of the other high performance chain getting non-trivial adoption in things that Ethereum already isn't doing. And that's not intended to be a negative statement or an accusatory statement. I think that's the way it is.
Okay. Are we talking about Cardano? Is that like the next? It's the third largest market cap, and it's the only proof of stake that's really up there in the top. I guess Solana's a proof of stake.
Yeah, I wouldn't even have Cardano even in the list I even just mentioned, because they're just like even that's a whole nother game. But yeah, like Solana would be the one I think has the most universal interest in the technology. And I think that the most people I've talked to, VCs, projects, otherwise, it's very interesting, I guess, to put it that way. And then Avalanche also has a fairly novel consensus mechanism. Both of these, these chains though are doing what, like 1/10,000th the true value of something like Ethereum, but then they have market caps of like 10 to 20% of Ethereum. So you can see the speculative interest. And that's not to say they're bad, but their interest has definitely outgrown the true utility that they have, which, that is what it is. So again, I'm not even necessarily saying that's bad, or I'm not trying to throw shade on those, but that's just the state of, I think, of the real usage.
Really good observation. Are there any others that come in that list? When you think about Solana, AVAX, are there one or two others that are kind of around there?
Yeah, so Terra is very interesting, mainly because they now have the USD token and how that is minted on chain. And they have a really interesting economic model with Luna. So basically, to create UST, you need to burn Luna, which is kind of interesting. So, thinking about something like that, and it's a permissionless system. So think about, USDC on Ethereum. Let's say you had to burn Ether in order to mint USDC. Like, that's kind of an interesting concept. So there's getting to be more and more traction. And then particularly because Terra launching initially in Southeast Asia, having its Chai platform, I mean, they're literally in the billions of dollars of transacted already on chain, which, I mean, that's in like a couple of years. So that's real world utility and usage that also gets very interesting. So now trying to enable some of that now in the US, I mean, that's something we would love to be, work on with them, and we're close with them and have been seeing what all this can look like. But now taking those assets, permissionlessly derived assets, you can now spend at, merchants across the US, to get really interesting.
That's very exciting. Any other names come to mind?
On the proof of stake side, those would be, I think, the main candidates that you'd see for sure.
And proof of work?
Those would be the main, the current ones, right? So Ethereum and Bitcoin are really the, absolutely predominant around just everything. There's, I think, some slight mentions around just they've been around for a while and have certain communities around like Litecoin, and then like even Bitcoin Cash. That one's been really challenging just because it's gone through like 3 or 4 community splits, even since it split originally. But I do, I just have a little bit of a bias just because Bitcoin Cash, at least what it's trying to do in terms of its narrative, what Roger talks about is what I love. So that's the one thing where I still like, you look at it, it's like, I want to see this work. And I like this narrative, and it could be wrong, it could be right, but those are the things that get potentially used as money. I have a very, very strong preference for. So I'm very deep in the DeFi world and have been using a lot of these other products. But when something comes up that has some fundamental utility as money, I get very interested in it more naturally. So like earlier in the year with all the algorithmic stable coins, like that was something I jumped in very, very aggressively to figure out how they all worked, what could work. What did all these look like? What were the differences in like their applications? That was the stuff that I'm very passionate about.
Will that work at one point?
Oh man, great question. As of now, no. None of the algorithmic approaches have really been sustainable. And I'd say the one I see that has the most current sustainability is something like Frax, where they have a little bit of a hybrid model where it's partially fractionalized partial fractionally reserved with its own token. I think it's at something like 10 or 15% collateralized by its governance token. That's interesting. It's not really fully there, but see, this is also how a lot of it works is you create these experiments, you see how it works, and then going back to our early conversation, it happens at rapid scale. All this stuff, the boom and bust of every single one of these tokens, basis cash, empty set dollar, dynamic set dollar, like I could go in the whole list. They all crash, burned, then went up, then went down, everything else in like less than a year. All of it is only 12 months old. So it happens, you can iterate really, really quickly with this.
Yeah, a little bit different than the space program in that sense. And we've had Roger Ver on here. He literally is giving away free Bitcoin Cash. If anybody wants free Bitcoin Cash, go watch the episode. He literally gives you his email, and a bunch of my team got some from him. So I'm a big fan of what he does there. Gas fees on Ethereum is one of the biggest complaints I get in my DeFi Academy. I'm telling you, all my students are complaining this week. And what I try to get them to do, Tyler, is I try to get them to put on their first yield swap trade, put on their first liquidity pool trade, buy a simple option on Ethereum, just so they understand these instruments, even at very small transaction prices. And they're all constantly complaining about the gas fees. I had Stanley Kulichev of Aave in here, and I said, when's ETH 2.0 coming? And his whole business is based on Ethereum, and he said, sometime in the next 10 years. And so I'm wondering, do the gas fees affect what you're trying to do? And do you have any personal opinions about them? I also had the CEO of Polygon on here. They're doing amazing stuff. Maybe it won't matter. How do these concepts play into what you're trying to do?
Oh, great question. So it impacts us a little, but at least the core dynamics of how Flexa works. So currently in staking your tokens, there is a cost, but it's really kind of a one-time thing, and then you're moving things around, assigning things within the contract. We also have upgraded the AMP token to allow for you to maintain custody of your tokens. So we're going to be upgrading the capacity, like kind of the collateral managers, to make that even cheaper. So it impacts us a little because our core functionalities aren't like all happening with repetition or repetitive on-chain transactions. So it's not as relevant to us. It is hyper relevant in that no one wants to spend Ethereum assets anymore. Who's going to spend USDC when it costs $25 to make the transaction? I mean, no one. So that's where it really affects us more, not as like an actual infrastructure or project itself, but the usability of these assets. I mean, that's...
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.